Hey, we're back. This time we're going to be taking a look at another one of the factions for GKR heavy hitters. This time around it's the SUPERSALTY Corporation. And they're part of the Sweet and Salty expansion pack for the game. And we'll get right in and take a look at how they compare to the other factions available in the game. First thing is the pilots. Same 8 pilots are available for all factions. So a lot of those depend on your playstyle and what you really want to do with the build. Again, all of our units have pretty much the exact same stats across the board. The only thing that are different are the speeds. And the thing that really sets each of the factions apart is the deck that you build with the weapon options that are unique to each faction. So the first thing I want to start with is the sentry gun. Even though the Sweet and Salty faction pack did not mention that it had them, it does have the sentry guns along with the little models to use. And the card here, if you don't have the Wastelands expansion, you might not know what those are. It was an add-on that came with the expansion. The normal factions all got them from that. The 2 new factions, Sweet and Salty, both get them from with the pack when you buy them, so that's a cool feature that they added on, something you don't have to track down later on. So anyway, our sentry guns start with a 913 speed, which sounds really high on a scale of 1 to 1,000 that the game uses. It sounds super high. The downside is that so is everybody else's sentry guns. Most, I think, if not all of them, are in the mid to high 900s. I know they're all in the 900s, which kind of defeats the purpose, but I think the only one slower is Hammer Strike at a 900. So to keep that in mind, your sentry turrets are going to be going after everybody else. 900 still in the upper range of the spectrum, though, so it's going to be shooting before almost any of the normal weapons, primary or secondary, and most all, if not all of the, well, most all of the support units. Some people's got some high recon. So it's not bad, just not top of the line. On to our normal support units. The first one we're going to look at here is our repair unit. Salt in Your Wound. That's a 213, making it the slowest repair unit in the game. Diamondback was the old holder of that title at 230 something. So we're even slower than that. Meaning that anytime you go to repair yourself, you're going to be at the very bottom of the barrel. 213 is going to be behind most weapons aside from maybe missile launchers and the artillery cannon on the ULTRASWEET heavy hitter. Other than that, yeah, a couple missile launchers, the only thing that's going to be going possibly after you. So that means your heavy hitter is going to be taking a lot of hits before your guy can attempt to repair it. So you have to keep that in mind when going to repair yourself. You're going to be going last, or very close to it. Onto our combat unit. This one is Send the Salt. They also call it Cindy. And Cindy here has 663, which actually puts her as the new ranking highest, fastest combat unit in the game. That title used to be held by Hammer Strike with a 650. So that aspect is nice, kind of counters the repair unit being so slow, the combat unit being so fast. Maybe you can get a little extra shot in there, a little damage to something before you're taking return fire. These always come in handy when you're comparing it to other people's support units, because if you're taking out a support unit, that 3 damage there can actually knock out a support unit before they ever get to do anything. In the case of like the repair unit here, you'd be able to take him out long before you got to do anything back. You might be able to blow up their repair unit before they repair any damage. Very nice to have a high combat unit. Onto our recon unit, we have Salt in Your Eye, which is a 863, which is definitely up there as far as recon units go. Hammer Strike holds the record on that with the 950, and I think somebody else has an 870, so it puts us in 3rd place overall. Not bad. Recon units really just going out and spotting anyway. So the damage is quite nice on there. So most of the time I end up using my recon, though, to spot things and take the occasional pot shot, but they're very fragile. They tend to go down pretty quick. Just need to keep these in mind. So you're middle of the road towards the top with the Recon, top of the line with that, and bottom of the barrel with that. So you're kind of balanced overall. Keep that in mind when you're planning out your turn, where your support units are going to fall throughout the firing line, so you can kind of expect what's going to happen and plan your turn around it. It should be worth noting that the ones in the expansion here do not come with the little clips to put on there to keep track of their hit points. You're actually meant to use these in place of the other ones, but we like to play 3v3 games, or even the occasional, God forbid, 6-may free-for-all. And in doing so, you need these little clips to keep track of your hit points. We took the ones from the starter set from the Recon units, since they only have 1 hit point anyway, and that gave us 4 extra. We used 2 of them with the Ultra Sweet, and 2 here for the Super Salty, so we have those markers to use. You also need a player board to use them, and if you have the Kickstarter version, you got those cool plastic boards, so you also have 4 of the regular cardboard ones, so you have the player boards to use as well. Onto the deck, this is what really makes the heavy hitter stand out from the others. So the first thing we're going to look at is our primary weapons. Now when building your heavy hitter, you get to choose 1 primary out of the 4 here. First up we have Savor the Flavor, which is a missile launcher. Missiles usually are pretty slow, so 400 and below tend to be missile launchers, so you're in the upper end of missile launchers there. 3 energy, 3 to 5 range, 6 damage is very nice. If this attack causes 3 or more damage to a heavy hitter, the first 2 damage must be randomly drawn from their hand if possible. That's pretty nice. Normally they get the option to discard from their hand or the top of their deck. This allows you to force them to take 2 damage out of their hand, which could break up a combo. Maybe they're setting up, especially if you're fighting Diamondback, who has those, I think it's Coil Strike, where you collect a bunch of them in your hand, and you can play them all for, you pay for 1, you get all the other ones for free. So that's a nice counter to that, to force them to discard cards out of their hand. You might break up their combo if they're looking to plan something. Very nice. Next we have the Sodium Shellac. That's a ballistic weapon. 63 is incredibly slow for a ballistic weapon. That's like below most missile speeds. This one's 2 energy, 2 to 4 range for 5 damage. Most of your primary weapons usually have 2, well this one's different. Usually you have 2 energy ones, 2 3 energy ones. The 2 energy usually do slightly less damage, so that's kind of acceptable on those. You can spend 1 energy to cause +1 damage. That allows you to make this a 3 for 6. Gives you a little bit of leeway, so you can use it as the 2 for 5, or you can use it as a 3 for 6. I really like the versatility of that, the fact that you can customize it to whatever you're shooting at. Next we have 1000 Grains. This one's an energy weapon, and again, incredibly slow for an energy weapon. Usually the energy weapons tend to be in the upper, like, 700s and up. So, super slow as far as that goes. 2 energy, 1 to 3 range, 5 damage. You can take 1 damage to make it cause 2 extra damage. So, possible 7 damage weapon is one of the more powerful ones in the game. Ranks right up there with King Wolf's Dire Laser. For only 2 energy is crazy, but you are damaging yourself once to do it. Just to keep that in mind. If your repair unit's out, maybe you can fire this, use the bonus, repair yourself, get that card right back. But at the same time, your repair unit and this are both very slow. So you may take a few hits waiting for this to power up before it actually fires too. So you got to keep that in mind. Next one here is Salted Earth. This is our brand new weapon type of explosive, which is really cool because there are no reactive cards that are a countermeasure to explosives. 563 puts it pretty standard middle range as far as weapon speeds go. 2 energy, 2 to 4 range for 4 damage. Kind of a lower end of primary weapons as far as 2 energy, 4 damage. Usually it's 2 and 5, but The special over here is on a miss, the intended target and all adjacent units to the target take 1 damage with no armor save, which is what makes up for that lower damage output for the energy cost on a primary. It's basically a large grenade, and if you hit the target, you do the normal damage. If you miss the target, though, you do splash damage, and the fact that it's 1 damage with no armor save, and it's an area of effect, so you get the initial hex and all the adjacent ones, so that's a pretty big area. Looking at this, say you were shooting at this heavy hitter, you're going to hit these 3 guys and possibly 3 more behind them. It's a whole 7-unit area that you're targeting there with that. So very powerful option there, and the fact that there's no countermeasure to it is just icing on the cake there. So out of these, my go-to pick is probably going to be Savor the Flavor. I really like the everything about that one. Being able to make your opponent discard cards out of their hand and break those possible combos. If I'm going against Diamondback, this is going to be my choice every time. I'm not even going to question that. If we're going against somebody else and Diamondback's not in the picture, I might be tempted to lean towards Salted Earth just to mess around with that new weapon type and those cool explosives. Though ideally, I don't want to miss my target, so I don't know how often that's going to happen, but you are going to roll crappy every now and then too, so it's kind of a trade-off there. Definitely Savor the Flavor is my first choice out of these, though. Sodium Shellac's up there as well. Super slow, though, is the only downside to that. But again, that being able to crank up the damage on there for extra energy gives it that versatility. I'd put that maybe even second over the Salted Earth. Though I do want to try that Salted Earth because the explosive has potential. So Savor the Flavor is definitely first. Then it's a toss-up between these two for my second choice. Obviously, you can only pick one, but I like to change it up in between games. So I'm not always playing the same combos. On to our secondary weapons. Now you get to choose 2 of these when designing your heavy hitter. So you kind of want to balance these with what you chose as a primary. If you chose a longer range weapon, then you want to make sure to have at least 1 short range weapon. I like to mix and match. If I chose a ballistic, I like to choose an energy and so on, so that you don't pile up on one specific type. If you bring all energy, for instance, and they bring countermeasures to energy, it's going to kind of ruin your day. So I like having a variety. Forces people to either have to bring a variety of defensive cards or waste defensive cards on things. You can also grab the explosives that don't have any counters to them and either make people waste spaces taking countermeasures to weapons they can't counter, or make them guess on whether they should bring counters at all. Get a nice variety here with 2 energy, 2 explosive, and 1 ballistic. No missiles as a secondary, which is kind of interesting. Keep that in mind if you're playing against Super Salty here. First one we're going to look at is Pugna Pinch. That's a ballistic weapon, 813. It's pretty high on the scale there. 1 energy, 2 to 5 range, 2 damage. Got to watch out for that point blank range, but having up to 5 is nice. And this attack deals +1 damage if the target is the Glory Hound. So you get an extra damage out of that. 1 energy for 3 damage if you're shooting at the Glory Hound, which is the first player. Very tempting as far as that goes. Kind of useless on the turns where you're the Glory Hound, but other than that, it's still a 1 energy for 2 damage weapon. It's pretty respectable, decent range, but yeah, being able to boost up that damage a little bit is very interesting, and it's a fast weapon too, which is nice. Next we have Salt Lick, which is an energy weapon. 613's pretty standard for energy. It's towards the mid to upper as far as weapons go. Again, it's on a scale of 1 to 1,000. 1 energy, 1 to 3 range, 2 damage, pretty standard for a secondary weapon. Deals +1 damage against support units, meaning for 1 energy you get a 3 damaging shot possibly on a support unit. That's enough to take out a combat unit if you roll good. if they fail their armor saves, but in the least it has potential to do quite a bit of damage. Not a bad one overall there though. Next we have Crystal Crackers. It's explosive, again that new damage type for this heavy hitter. 313 is a bit slow, but I'm rating these similar to like missiles, so I think they're going to mostly be on the slower end there. 1 energy, 1 to 2 range, kind of short, 2 damage. On a successful hit, this weapon automatically hits all other units adjacent to the target with a 1 damage explosive attack. Similar to the explosive primary weapon, except this one does it on a hit, the other one does it on a miss. And they get armor save against this one, so it's kind of a trade-off there. But again, if you're targeting the heavy hitter, you're going to hit the heavy hitter, the 3 squares in front of it, and the 3 squares behind it. So a 7 hex area, which is really nice. All for 1 energy. Sure, it's kind of weak on the up close, but very powerful in its own way. One thing to keep in mind on these, though, is that it's all other units adjacent to the target. So it doesn't specify friend or foe. So I'm under the assumption that if you're point blank 1 square away from the target when you fire this, you're also going to be in that blast range. So gotta watch it. 1 range on a weapon with a blast radius of 1 range is kind of a oddball choice there. But sometimes you might want to sacrifice it. Maybe you have armor, maybe you have extra damage you can burn. Maybe you have your repair unit lined up to fix yourself. It might be worth taking a possible damage yourself to knock out a couple support units. Next we have You Mad Bro, which is an energy. I love the name. The picture's kind of funny too. And energy weapon, 463 is pretty slow for an energy weapon. 2 energy, 2 to 3 range, 3 damage, pretty respectable. If this attack deals 2 or more damage to a heavy hitter, it immediately rotates them 180 degrees. Doing 2+ damage on a weapon that only does 3 damage is kind of rough. I've talked about this before in other weapons. If it triggers, it's pretty mean because you can spin somebody around, and unless they have the maneuver card that allows them to spin back around, they're basically useless. Being so slow of a card, though, kind of negates that somewhat, but it could spin them around and allow one of your other slower weapons possibly to shoot at now a flank because you're behind them because they spun around. So that's kind of interesting. You can also spin them around so their weapons can't fire at the target they were intending to shoot at, so it can screw up them too. But being so low in the firing line, I mean, it's towards the middle, but there's a lot of things that may shoot before this which kind of negate its effectiveness a little. Had it been maybe a 600, it would be a lot more useful. Still an interesting ability if you can get it to trigger. Again, getting 2+ damage through on a weapon that only does 3 damage to begin with isn't as easy as it sounds. Next we have Pillar of Salt, another explosive weapon. 413, it's pretty fast as far as the explosive weapons go. 1 energy, 3 to 5 range for 1 damage. So that's not stellar there, and you got that 1-2 blind spot. A trade-off on this one is you can roll your attack dice on a 5+, you can hit a building within range. If it's successful, all units adjacent to the building take 1 damage with no armor save. So again, it's a lower powered weapon, but because of the new explosive thing there, it has possibility. I like the fact that it's all adjacent to the building, so you can shoot a building, hit somebody behind it that's in cover, that's not even in your line of sight, and take damage from them. It's a good way to pick off a repair unit hiding behind something, or multiple support units huddled around the building, getting ready to multi-tag it at the end of the turn. Interesting concept there. That's probably what I would use it for most, is to dissuade people from huddling around a building to tag it multiple times in a turn and force them to kind of spread out more or fear of taking damage. Very interesting option though. Of all the choices here, I kind of like Pugna Pinch. The possible 3 damage against the Glorion's nice, especially depending on the player count. If you're playing a lower player count, this is even better because there's more of a chance that your target is going to be the Glorion. Salt looks very nice as well. That extra damage versus support units is useful. I do like the explosive round weapons. The trade-off of them possibly hitting yourself is kind of rough. Of the two, I kind of like Pillar of Salt better because of the no armor save. Sure, only does 1 damage, but this one with only the 1 to 2 range, there's a lot better chance of you hitting somebody, blowing yourself up in the process. I like being able to shoot a building from across the board and do the damage. And we don't have a lot of really long-range weapons on this build either, so overall I might go with Pugna Pinch and Pillar of Salt, with Shellac being up there. And but yeah, just to trade it up a little bit, that gives us some range to go with a close range primary weapon, gives us some blast damage to take out support units, even ones out of line of sight that they don't get an armor save, which really makes that worth it. 1 damage is kind of meh, but that no armor save is what really saves that card. Onto our orbital strikes. 113 on these is pretty average. I think it puts us almost smack in the middle. There is a couple slower than us. The ULTRASWEET Hammer Strike, possibly King Wolf, I think. But also only 2 higher than us, so you're on the upper end there. Orbital strikes are very powerful weapons. These ones take 2 energy for 4 damage, which is very nice. The unlimited range is what really makes these. However, they are one-use weapons, so when you fire them, they go to your damage pile instead of your discard pile. So every time you fire, you're basically losing a hit point. You can use your repair guy to get these back later on, and they're definitely worth taking at least 1. It's up to you if you choose 1, both, or neither. But they're super powerful weapons. You just have to keep in mind that aspect of hurting yourself when you fire them. Next we have our deploy cards. You can deploy your support units for 4 energy, or you can use one of these deploy cards to deploy them for half the price for 2 energy. Depending on the pilot, you can even reduce that farther. Ideally, you want these to lower the cost of deployment so you have more energy to work with for your weapons and movement and other things. Our primary weapon, you're probably looking at a 3 energy in this case. A couple of the secondaries we liked were 1 energy, so there's that on there. But deploying a unit for 4 only allows you 1 point left over without having to push your reactor. So you can fire 1 secondary or move 1 space before it starts to hurt you. Whereas if you use one of these for deployment, only takes 2, leaves you with 3 extra energy. You could fire that primary, you could fire a couple of the secondaries, you get to move on top of that. So you got a lot more options if you have these in your deck. I try to include as many of these as possible, if not all of them, in most of my builds, just for that fact that most of the time you're going to want to be able to discount the cost of deploying your units. Now again, this is going to be hit or miss depending on who you're playing against. If you know the play style of people you're playing against, if they don't go out targeting your support units actively, then it might not be worth your while to have so many deploy cards, because if they're not destroying them, you don't need to keep redeploying them. Once they're out, they're out. If you play against somebody who's constantly taking out your units, then having more deploy cards is going to help you to keep them on the board and keep your numbers up. Next we have our movement cards, and these are identical for all of the heavy hitters. In both cases, I like both cards. Play both cards if you can. If you have to choose one or the other, usually quick rotation is the one that I get knocked out of mine. Quick rotation allows you to rotate the heavy hitter to any facing. It also requires you to discard a card and draw a card. So it helps to cycle cards through your hand, but at the same time, the rotation really shouldn't be too much of an issue unless you're getting hit by something like the You Mad Bro weapon, which rotates your heavy hitter. Then you might not be in arc to do what you want to do. Most of the time, you shouldn't need this unless special circumstances arise, but it's nice to have just in case. As far as the jump jets go, this is almost a must include, and it allows you to basically move 1 extra space. You can use it to get into range to fire a weapon you might not be in range of. You can use it to get out of range. Say you have a minimum range on your weapon and you can't fire point blank. Allows you to drop back a space. Allows you to duck behind a cover, behind a building. out of a fire arc of an opponent, or any number of different things. Maybe duck behind a building to get out of line of sight of a support unit they're using as a spotter for indirect fire missile weapons. Lots of different uses for this one. Definitely worth having. Next we get into our reaction cards, and we'll break these down a little bit. First off, here we have the flank defense, and these ones I talk about in almost every video. Depending on your skill at piloting, how many players are in the game, and what's going on, you shouldn't need these. If you're playing a 1v1 game, or even 2v2, the chances of a guy getting behind you are pretty low if you're playing conservatively and watching your back, basically. Cover it with your support units. Don't let them get behind you. Flank shots shouldn't be that big of a deal. Maybe they get a recon unit, which are fast. They fly up over a building, but for the majority, they shouldn't be behind you. Now, if you're playing a 4-player free-for-all or a 3v3 game, then there's a lot more things to keep track of. There's a lot more chances for something to get behind you. But unless you're in those situations, I almost never take the flank defense cards, because I just don't find people getting behind me enough to make it worthwhile for taking them. Next we have our fake shot cards, and these I include in almost every build if possible to get them in there, because they're super handy to have. For 1 energy you get to re-roll, and if you're counting on a big shot to go off to take out something and you miss, you can re-roll. Or if, in this case, you have the main cannon that does the extra damage if you miss. So if you hit with it and you weren't counting on it hitting, you can re-roll and try to miss, oddly enough. Biggest use for these, though, is critical fumbles. You roll those double ones, and this allows you to re-roll. Unfortunately, you're stuck with it whenever you re-roll the second time, so if your second roll sucks even more, it's kind of a loss there, but hard to beat the ability to re-roll the dice for 1, especially in those situations where you really need it to hit or you roll that critical fumble. And last we have our defense cards, and these are singled out by weapon type. You got missile defense, ballistic defense, and energy defense. There are no defense cards versus the new explosive weapons that SUPERSALTY uses, or the artillery cannon that ULTRASWEET has. Keep that in mind. Depending on who you're playing against, really is going to make a difference on what of these you want to bring. Factions like Hammer Strike tend to be very missile heavy, in which case you're going to want your missile defense cards. Factions like King Wolf tend to be very energy heavy with that dire laser. You're going to want energy defense cards. So these are more of a guessing game of knowing what your opponent is going to be bringing against you and their play style, what weapons you think they're going to choose. It's kind of like playing rock, paper, scissors. You have to decide what you think they might bring and bring the cards that possibly counter those. If you end up bringing a energy weapon defense card, they don't have any energy weapons. It's a wasted card. It kind of sucks, but at the same time it gives you basically a free card that you can discard when you take damage. It's not going to hurt you at all to lose that out of your deck. So keep that in mind. They're not completely wasted, but again, yeah, that part of it is a guessing game. Estimating what your opponent's going to bring and knowing a little bit about your opponent's factions and what they're heavily based on, so you know what to bring. As I mentioned at the beginning, the same 8 pilots are available for all the factions, and they completely really depend on your playstyle as well as your build and what you're going for. I personally like Jay, Nyx, and Ike. Nyx and Ike are both energy sabers. Jay allows you to draw extra sponsor cards if you tag 2 or more buildings. There's a couple others in there. I've recently got a newfound appreciation for Marlowe. So it really all breaks down into what fits your play style. There really is no best pilot for best heavy hitter. It really all depends on, like I said, your play style, who you're playing against, how you do your pilots. Some people do draft. We usually tend to just let people draw. It depends on how many times you've played. You don't always want people taking the same thing, but you have to figure out some format, otherwise somebody might take the one you want. So you got to go around and come up with how you're going to pick your pilots, but there's lots of pilots that combo well with pretty much any heavy hitter. It's just a matter of how you play them. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for our look at the Super Salty faction for GKR heavy hitters. I hope it helped you decide what weapons and things you might take, how to counter if somebody's using this, and just give you a general idea of how this stacks up versus the other factions in the game. As always, thank you guys for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next one.